France didn't crumble overnight. It wasn't cowardice, and it wasn't because the French soldier was weak. In fact, France entered the Second World War with what many experts considered the strongest army in Europe. Better tanks, better artillery, and more manpower on paper than Germany. So how did a country that was supposed to be unstoppable decide in a matter of weeks that continuing the fight simply wasn't worth it? To understand that moment, the moment France emotionally, mentally, and politically collapsed, you have to go backwards. Not to 1940, but to 1914. Because the First World War didn't just drain France, it scarred the country so deeply that every decision they made in the interwar years was shaped by trauma, fear, and a desperate obsession with never letting that nightmare happen again. France lost 1.3 million troops in World War I. Entire regions were flattened, villages vanished forever, an entire generation of young men was wiped out, and the survivors, the politicians who came after them, and the generals who trained the next army, all of them carried a psychological weight that Germany didn't share in the same way. So when the 1930s came, France built its strategy around one goal: never again allow German forces to storm into French soil in a giant bloody slugfest. They weren't planning for mobility, speed, or improvisation. They were planning for another grinding war of trenches and attrition. That's where the Maginot Line came from. It wasn't stupidity, it was trauma. It was France building the world's most expensive anxiety wall, concrete proof that they would never again face another Verdun. But trauma blinds you, and the blindness that shaped French planning was devastating. French generals believed that because they had won World War I, the next war would look the same. Germany would attack through the same areas, in the same ways, using the same slow methods. They ignored the possibility of rapid breakthroughs. They dismissed warnings that tanks and planes would transform warfare, and they greatly underestimated how bold, risky, and improvisational the German leadership could be. That brings us to 1940. When Germany finally launched its attack, France was confident. They had more tanks than Germany, and many of their models were stronger. Their troops were disciplined. Their artillery was exceptional. On paper, France had all the advantages. But Germany wasn't fighting the old war. They weren't crawling across no man's land. They were moving with speed, coordination, and aggression. The armoured spearheads, supported by dive bombers and radio-connected commanders, sliced through the Ardennes, an area the French High Command believed was impossible for a large mechanized force to cross. The French generals actually laughed at the idea, and then it happened. German armoured columns tore through the forests, burst out into open terrain, and raced for the English Channel. They bypassed the Maginot Line entirely. They split the French and British armies in half, and suddenly, a country that thought it was ready for a slow, organised, trench-style conflict found itself trapped in a storm of speed and chaos. This is where morale began to unravel. French units fought hard, many to the very edge of endurance, but they were doing it under leaders who were frozen in shock. Commanders were stunned at how fast the situation changed. Communications collapsed. Counterattacks were ordered too late or in the wrong direction. Entire divisions were left without coordination. Decision-making slowed at the exact moment when everything needed to be fast. For the average French soldier, it felt like the ground was falling from under them. They weren't losing because they lacked courage. They were losing because the world had changed and their leaders had not. And when an army realizes its leaders don't understand the battlefield, morale collapses faster than any front line. Within weeks, the French government faced a horrifying truth. The map showed disaster. The enemy was deep inside the country. Refugees were flooding the roads, and the political leadership began to doubt not just victory, but survival. This is when the emotional legacy of World War I returned like a ghost. Every politician in Paris remembered the meat grinder of 1914 to 1918. They remembered the mountains of letters sent to grieving families. They remembered entire towns losing every young man they had. They remembered conscription riots. They remembered the psychological toll. They asked themselves a quiet, terrible question: are we going to do that again? And many answered, no, not again. It's not worth it. Once that doubt formed, it spread. Some leaders argued that continuing the fight would destroy France entirely. Others believed that the country needed to preserve lives and infrastructure, even if it meant temporary humiliation. Some felt the army had already done enough, and others, especially the older generation who had lived through the last war, simply couldn't bear the idea of repeating France's worst trauma. That was the moment the psychological battle was lost, not on the front lines, not in a tank duel, but in the minds of the people who had to decide whether to keep fighting or not. So France turned to an armistice. But this is where the story becomes almost theatrical and genuinely haunting. Hitler demanded that the French delegation meet him in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed the armistice in 1918, ending World War I. He had the carriage dragged out of a museum, placed back on the tracks, and prepared for what he saw as poetic justice. For Hitler, this wasn't just a negotiation, it was a revenge performance. In 1918, German leaders had sat in that carriage, humiliated, forced to acknowledge their defeat. Now, in 1940, Hitler reversed the roles. The French delegation arrived knowing they had to sign something that would effectively end their country's independence, and they had to sit in the exact same wooden seats where their own leaders had once imposed terms on the Germans. When the session opened, Hitler didn't stay long. He listened to the opening statement, stood up, walked out, and left his subordinates to handle the details. His message was clear: Germany was no longer the defeated power. The humiliation of Versailles had been avenged. And for the French delegation, this moment was crushing. They weren't signing a minor agreement. They were signing away half their territory, the occupation of Paris, the disarming of their army, and the acceptance of German control. They were signing the end of France as a major power, inside a symbol of their own previous triumph that had now been twisted against them. This wasn't just political defeat, it was emotional disintegration. The French leaders who approved the armistice weren't doing it out of fear alone. They genuinely believed the country couldn't survive another long, grinding conflict. Their traumatic memory was so strong that surrender felt like the only rational choice to preserve the nation. The tragedy is that they never fully realized how close Germany actually was to overstretch. Germany had supply problems. Their tank divisions were worn down. Their troops were exhausted. A prolonged fight, especially one fought overseas from North Africa or the colonies, could have changed the entire war. But trauma doesn't calculate strategy. Trauma calculates survival, and so France chose to sign. Some French soldiers were furious, many resisted, some continued the fight overseas. But inside mainland France, the decision was final. The country had decided that the war wasn't worth the cost, not because they were weak, but because they were haunted by the memory of the last time they fought a giant industrial war to the bitter end. The moment the French gave up wasn't a single second on a clock. It was a slow accumulation of doubt, fear, trauma, and leadership paralysis. It was a generation trying to avoid reliving the worst pain they had ever known. And when Germany's rapid advance smashed through their assumptions, the psychological foundation collapsed faster than any fortress. What makes the story tragic is that France had everything it needed to fight effectively: manpower, tanks, industry, even allies. But war isn't decided only by equipment. It's shaped by memory, psychology, and whether a nation believes the struggle is worth the cost. In 1940, France reached the heartbreaking conclusion that it wasn't, and that decision became one of the turning points of the entire century. If you enjoyed this deep dive and want more powerful wartime breakdowns, make sure you hit subscribe. It really supports the channel and pushes these videos to more people. And let me know in the comments, what moment in World War II should I cover next?